Hi, I'm Dr. Melissa Walton-Shirley today with Dr. Bob Giugliano. We're going to be talking about LDL cholesterol. Welcome to this conversation for the Heart.org and Medscape Cardiology. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, glad to be here. Thank you.
So the first time we probably heard about the theory of ultra-low LDL levels was in the late 80s. Science magazine was published, and it talked about perhaps looking at what happens to patients when we lower LDL to ultra-low levels. So can you bring me up to speed for the last 3.5 decades of how we got here?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting story. I think in part it begins with the Nobel Prize, Brown and Goldstein in '86. First describing the potential benefits of very low LDL cholesterol. And in one key part of their speech, which was also published, they talk about physiologic LDL maybe being on the order of 25 to 40 milligrams per deciliter. And that really, I think, started the ball rolling with therapies then trying to achieve lower and lower LDLs.
So that there were early on a lot of concerns like neurocognitive impact, dementia. I read information about vitamin D, metabolism, those cancer risk. So can you address where we are with that today?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that data was observational. I mean, not a lot, I think almost all of it were observational correlations. And if you think about who naturally has an LDL that low, generally those patients are more likely to be elderly, frail, malnourished, or have cancer. So in the general population, if you eat a Western diet, it's very hard to achieve such low LDLs. You either have a genetic predisposition, or on a Western diet, you may be frail, malnourished, have cancer, or some other chronic disease. So then if you compare those patients to patients who are folks who have more typical LDLs of a population, well, of course, you'll see associations that aren't necessarily causative. So I think we were misled by those early observations that weren't adjusted for these other confounders.
So let's switch gears a bit to the ApoB camp. There are those that advocate that ApoB should be measured in every patient, that we really don't know where we are unless we measure that. So how do you feel about that? Do you use ApoB measurement?
Yeah, I use ApoB measurements occasionally, and I think I could view an alternate universe where we stumble across ApoB assays first before LDL assays, and then that's just the language we used. ApoBs are, I think, a more accurate measurement because it incorporates not only LDL but other atherogenic particles. In practice, the LDLs are probably good enough, and they're so widespread and entrenched in our practice of medicine, and every laboratory around the world can measure them, or at least give you a calculated LDL based on one of many formulas that we now have with total cholesterol and the other particles we're familiar with. But if you wanted to be more precise, apolipoprotein B would be a better integrator and has a slightly better correlation with outcomes and risk than LDL cholesterol.
So does it matter how we get to an LDL of 40? And specifically, is the person who achieved an LDL of 40 with a statin and diet, perhaps maybe even ezetimibe, are they less safe, less protected than someone who got there with a PCSK9 inhibitor, for instance?
No, that's a great question. I would say we don't know the answer for sure, so I'll share my opinion and observation from decades of study in this area. I would say if you take two equal people that they have the same demographics and risk factors, and one gets to an LDL, let's say by your example on statin plus ezetimibe, because the potency of a high intensity statin plus ezetimibe is roughly that of a PCSK9 inhibitor. I think that their risk moving forward would be very similar. There's some potential off-target benefits of high-dose statins and anti-inflammatory effect. That remains still a bit debated. Maybe early post-ACS we see a signal there. I'm not sure about over the long term. So I think by and large they generally would be at similar risk of future cardiovascular events if you got there with a statin plus ezetimibe or with a PCSK9 inhibitor.
So I want to ask you about your clinical approach to two different patients with the same LDL of 150. One is a postmenopausal female. Let's say she's 60 years of age. She has no known coronary disease. The person in the next room is a male with an LDL of 150 with no coronary disease. And they're both asking you, do I need to have my LDL treated? How do you approach those patients? And is your approach different?
Yeah. No, my approach is similar in that I would first look at their, a risk of future cardiovascular events. So I use a 10-year ASCVD risk score. I think, in Europe, there's a different risk score that's used. I try to identify patients who are going to likely benefit the most from LDL lowering. It also gives us an idea of where we're going, how low of an LDL we want to target. I would suspect for these two patients, and we don't have the full profile, do they have other risk factors for ASCVD? Are they diabetic? Are they hypertensive, et cetera? But I suspect you probably end up wanting to treat both of these patients with an LDL of 150. And then it's a question of, how intensively would you want to lower their LDL?
Screening is a hot topic these days. So would you employ a calcium score? And let's say the female had a calcium score of 0 and they're postmenopausal with an LDL of 150. Would you then invite that patient to consider treatment?
And they're age 60, if I recall. Is
Correct.
That right? Yeah. So I would have a discussion with the patient. I would say that the calcium score of 0 is good news for your coronary. But, we haven't imaged the arteries of the head and neck, the abdomen, the lower extremities. And I would want to also consider all their other potential risk factors. But I would say that a calcium score of 0 would be good news in a 60-year-old patient. If they were 40, I would say, well, the calcium score may underestimate your risk because it may be mostly a lipid-rich plaque and not much calcium there.
And then there are also some studies that suggest there's not a huge mortality benefit. If you look across the major trials, even in those trials that LDL levels were achieved that were on target, we still didn't see a huge mortality benefit in some of those trials. So how do you address that criticism?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. One is, patients who are higher risk, secondary prevention, for example, with elevated LDL. I think it's clear that LDL lowering with statins, in particular, reduce cardiovascular mortality. The all-cause mortality, we all have to die of something. So, and I don't expect an effect on non-cardiovascular deaths. So, of course, the point estimates for all-cause mortality are less robust than they are for cardiovascular mortality, which is the target with statins. With PCSK9 inhibitors, we certainly saw signals with alirocumab in higher risk post-ACS patients. We're going to hear at the ESC meeting data from the open label extension trial of FOIA with evolocumab in a somewhat lower risk population. With ezetimibe, there's really only one good long-term study, the IMPROVE-IT trial, which did not show any reduction in mortality. So I think in patients with established ASCVD or ACS, you're most likely to see mortality reductions in the highest risk patients and those who were treated longer and aggressively. In primary prevention, the data are a bit more sparse, but I have no reason to think that we wouldn't see a similar signal for reduction in cardiovascular mortality. We just have to follow patients much longer. These patients have less severe disease, and I think this could be answered in future trials, followed longer and more intensively. So that's kind of part one of my answer. And part two would be, it's not all about death. Sure, we'd like to live longer and increase the length of life, but I'd also like to live without a myocardial infarction, without a stroke, or without a need for peripheral procedures to treat peripheral arterial disease. So even if we didn't see much of a difference in mortality, and one group of patients lived without myocardial infarction, stroke, et cetera, well, that would be a big gain.
So my last question is this. Do you think that we have followed patients long enough that we're completely satisfied that we aren't going to see some deleterious effects of significant LDL lowering?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I would like to follow patients longer, for sure. The active comparisons of treatment and placebo, 5 years are generally what we consider long-term trials. Again, at the ESC, we'll be presenting some data out to 8 years. So there'll be additional information forthcoming. But look, as clinicians, when we treat our patients with hyperlipidemia, that's usually a lifelong decision. So we're treating patients for many decades. And there we don't have great data for long-term follow-up with a placebo comparison or some kind of reasonable control population. So sure, I'd like to see much longer-term data to give additional reassurance that there aren't very late complications or adverse events related to long-term suppression of the LDL. But I'd have to say this, that if you look in nature at patients who have won the gene lottery and for whatever reason don't produce or can easily excrete cholesterol and have low levels, they do very well over the long term, over decades, over their lifespan, with lower LDLs than the kind of typical Western patient who follows a Western diet.
Sure. And that's the real definition of all natural, isn't it? For
Yeah.
sure. Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so very much for your time today. We appreciate it. And we appreciate you joining us today on the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
Thank you.